Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining this live webinar on Rethinking Development Assistance for Lebanon. My name is Ronnie Hamad. I'm the chair of the Advocate Committee of LIFE, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. LIFE is a membership organization of Lebanese in the diaspora who work in finance, law, consulting, and tech. It's got 1,400 members across 15 chapters around the world, from Sydney to Dubai, London, and Washington. Its mission is to connect members, support the future generation through scholarships, mentorships, and helping them find jobs, and then promoting job creation and entrepreneurship, and finally, to advocate for social and economic reform. We are all well aware of the multiple crises Lebanon has been facing in the past few years. The economy has shrunk by more than half since 2019, and as one of the most highly indebted countries in the world at 180% of GDP, it's defaulted on its debt repayments in 2020 and has no access to borrowing from financial markets. Government revenues, which used to average 20% of GDP, are now down to 6-7%. We're barely $1 billion or $1.5 billion a year. The financial system is bankrupt. Most Lebanese lost their savings and pensions. The lira lost 98% of its value, and emigration, particularly among the youth, has accelerated. The resulting poverty is widespread, and hunger and suffering has increased. In the past, donors provided assistance, but the government avoided any meaningful reforms. Today, donors are dangling tens of billions of dollars in commitments on condition they undertake macroeconomic and sector reforms. But with no president, no prime minister, no governor, and the acting government and parliament paralyzed, donor support is down to a trickle. What should the international donor community do? And is there tough conditionality warranted in the face of all this suffering? To help us navigate these questions, I am delighted to be joined by two leading experts and former colleagues on the topic. I will start by introducing them, get in a few questions, then give you an opportunity to ask questions in the chat. Diwan is the research director at the Finance for Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics. He received his PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. He spent over 15 years at the World Bank in the Research and Middle East departments, was country director for Ethiopia, Sudan, Ghana, and other countries. He led many ambitious reforms, particularly the Ethiopia Productive Safety Net, Ethiopia's Protection of Basic Services Program. And in West Africa, he undertook initiatives to support commercial agriculture, natural resource development, and jobs for youth, programs that I think are very relevant to our discussion today. He is a well-established publisher of many books and publications and holds many teaching positions at New York University, Columbia, and Harvard. Diwan and Sayed spent more than 25 years at the World Bank, leading major strategic engagements, business development, reform programs, and policy dialogue on economic and human development. She worked in the Middle East region, as well as in East Asia, South Asia, and Europe. She is currently a non-resident fellow at the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center. Her sectors of expertise are social protection, labor, jobs, education, poverty, gender, in addition to fragility and conflict. She's the author of multiple publications and an economist by training, and with undergraduate and graduate degrees from Stanford and Columbia. She's also the architect of the social protection program in Lebanon called DAM, which I'm sure she'll talk about, and serves on several nonprofit boards that help to preserve Lebanon's human capital. Isha, let me start with you. To help us set the stage for the discussion, can you help us understand what is the role of development assistance and under what circumstances is it effective in helping a country's economic development?
Thanks, Ronnie, and good to be with you today. I see many friends on the screen. This is, I think, a very useful occasion to really think together. I mean, clearly Lebanon needs all the help it can get right now. As you said, the situation is deplorable, but that help has to come in the right way for it to be useful. And so, you know, we have to think of how this can happen. So let's think of this meeting as a bit of a working meeting where we can come up with, you know, constructive ideas on how we as a group can help make that happen, right? Now, you know, official assistance, how to make it useful, occupies lots of people. World Bank has tens of thousands of people, the IMF, ministries of finance around the world. and it's a hotly debated topic, but obviously it can help, but it can also hurt if it's not given in the right way. In Lebanon today, it can help in many ways, as you suggested. The state is in very bad shape. It's 10 times smaller than it was. And so how to think about recovery, the right time when politics gets right. Do we grow from a low base at 2-3%, or can we jump back to this fast recovery? Uh, can there be a big push somehow and not grow back at 2-3%, something like a Marshall Plan? How to think about that? But more in terms of immediate needs, how do we keep the country alive, society in good shape? How do we not get stuck in a poverty and violence track until the moment comes for the big push? So how to help society in the right way? This is the good stuff, but the dangers is that it can be misused. It can be used by politicians for clientelistic purposes. It can help them delay reforms, get them off the hook. It can get people to become dependent on aid and not work hard to support themselves and their communities. And so we need to build the case, build a vision for how aid could be best used for Lebanon, and also how to monitor it and how to put pressure on donors for this to happen, because we cannot count really on government where there is very little capacity and will right now to do so. So that as an introduction, I think these are some of the issues we will discuss during this hour.
Yeah, that's very useful. I think the question of how it can be used and misused is really critical to this conversation, and I think we'll get back to it a bit more. Maybe Haneen, I know you've been on the ground for many years. Maybe you could describe what's the situation in Lebanon today with respect to basic social services and the conditions of people, particularly after this crisis that we just described.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much for convening this panel. So indeed, I mean, I think most observers of Lebanon would recognize that situation economically, you've already mentioned it, but socially is also very dire. You mentioned a figure, the collapse of public expenditure. That went from actually 35% of GDP prior to 2019 to about 6% of GDP. This is an enormous collapse, and it translates in terms of health and education, social services, to even bigger collapse. Before 2019, health and education spending, public spending was about $1.5 billion, and that has gone to less than 500, at least as of the latest budget, 2024. Real wages have collapsed by 5 times. We see there's a flight out of the public sector. And of course, it's a qualified education and health personnel and others who are leaving, in addition to the youth and the skilled workers that you mentioned in the private sector. And this has meant, for example, in education, there's been a significant drop in public school enrollment of about 27% between 2020 and 2023. So in 3 years, we're talking about a reduction in public school enrollment of 27%. This is very large. Now, some might have gone to private schools, but we know that many could not afford even some of the sort of more cost-effective private schools. And more worrying than enrollment is the number of learning days, school days that have been lost. COVID globally meant about 170 days were lost for most countries around the world. But in Lebanon, on top of that, since COVID, we've had another 160 days of learning gone. This has to do with strikes of schools and of teachers and paralysis and the like. On the health side, it doesn't look any better. We have about 30% of children are not receiving basic primary health services. This is all figures from UN. And malnutrition is increasing as we see that more children are skipping a meal and going to bed hungry. Now, all of this is coming together, unfortunately, to mean the number of people in need in Lebanon has increased tremendously. before 2019, this number was primarily the people in need was the biggest population were the Syrian refugees, the displaced population, and the Lebanese constituted a small fraction of it. Today, about half of what's estimated as 3.5 million people in need, half of that, a bit more than that, are Lebanese. So you've got a big increase overall, but that increase has come from the Lebanese population. And poverty, there's the numbers, of course, that are always thrown around, but at least we know that poverty for Lebanese has doubled. And I just want to say, incidentally, the World Bank will be producing or issuing some new numbers on poverty very soon. I think it's important to look at that. But certainly, I believe that the number will look like they're at least doubled from whatever they were. So in a nutshell, if this kind of deterioration of human capital is not stopped or arrested or redressed, we are talking by our estimates of a drag on growth, on economic growth of at least 2 percentage points of GDP per year in the short and medium term. If we measure in a different way, World Bank produced a human capital index. The last one was based in 2020. And that index is something called 0.5. What this means is that if a child is born today, by the time she reaches the age of 18, she is only 50% productive as what she can be. And that's 2020, and these numbers really reflect pre-crisis. So you can imagine what that number, and in terms of its impact on productivity and long-term growth, is for the economy.
So just to follow up, the 2% that you're talking about that's being shaved off of GDP is a result of the increase in the number of people who are dependent on services or aid?
This is a result. Well, this is the outcome of this deterioration of human capital from enrollment, health outcomes, and the like.
Okay, thank you for that. So I wondered if you maybe could give us a little history of aid in Lebanon, the magnitude of it, and the kind of conditionality that's been involved, and and where we are today, and how do we think about this?
Yeah, that's a good idea. It will ground us in reality. So I put some notes on that. ODA has fluctuated in Lebanon post-civil war.
ODA, the official development.
Very good. Official Development Assistant. We start using acronyms now. ODA. So it has fluctuated between 2 and 5% of GDP a year. Lebanon was not a darling of the international community, say like Jordan was, but still, on average, it received more than the average developing countries. There were 4 peaks post-war. The first was in the early 90s during Hariri's reconstruction, lots of support, especially from the GCC. In 2001 and 2, there was Paris 1, Paris 2 conferences organized by Chirac. The financial situation of Lebanon was very fragile, and this managed to get close to $5 billion in commitment and saved the day and gave us another, nearly 20 years before the ultimate financial collapse. Then in 2008, after Hariri's assassination, Paris 3 put together a pretty large package, close to $8 billion. This was started to be more conditional than in the past because donors started realizing that support was helping the country avoid reforms. And the 4th phase is in the 2010s, after the beginning of the Syrian civil war, and this is mainly about humanitarian support for refugees. So a few facts to help us in our conversation. Total post-war, about $25 billion disbursed, 55% from the GCC, so historically the main financier from Lebanon, for Lebanon. After 2016, Saudi Arabia and the GCC withdrew that support, and that was a major contributor, the key contributing factor to the subsequent financial collapse. So 55% of the $25 billion from the GCC, 20% from the World Bank. So it's always been a major financier to Lebanon, 20% from the EU, again, very important, and about 5% from the US. It's good to keep in mind the last big conference for Lebanon, 2018, the Sadr conference organized by Macron. Major pledges, 12, $13 billion, extremely conditional, none have been disbursed. None of the conditions have been satisfied to date. Another comment, the rise in the global support for the Syrian refugees, and after the port explosion, also humanitarian support for Lebanon, mainly going through NGOs, not through the state. We're starting to talk of the NGOization of Lebanon, around $2 billion a year being dispersed, largely through UN agencies and various NGOs. Finally, the World Bank has continued to be quite active in Lebanon, reshuffling some existing commitment, adding some loans also, financing the national safety net, Hanin's baby, really, some direct payment to teachers. I'm sure Hanin will talk about that. An ambitious but somewhat controversial regional project to fix the electricity sector, and very recently, another quite controversial loan to support agriculture. So I think these are elements we can toy with as we project to the future.
So maybe just to help the audience understand, when we talk about reforms, can you tell us, like, what do we learn? What reforms are we talking about? And what do we learn from these lessons of development assistance? I mean, you've also worked in, Sudan, Ethiopia, Ghana, very different countries, but there are similar situations. Ethiopia also went through a civil war and others. What lessons did we learn about good development and effective development assistance, particularly in Lebanon? What are the type of reforms are we talking about?
I think we learned two lessons at least. First, that we can argue that support in the past has allowed government to escape their responsibilities to engage in needed reforms. And I'll give you one example, the electricity sector. The electricity sector has had major losses in the past. It's not rocket science to produce electricity. We all know that, and to do that in profitable ways. Yet, that sector contributes to 40% at the end of the day of Lebanese public debt. This could have been fixed long time ago. It wasn't, for political reasons, obviously, and repeated conditionality and offers to put money on the table if that was fixed were not followed. So I think we learned two things. We learned, first of all, that supporting the system. The financial system could have collapsed much earlier at much lower costs. The financial situation could have been fixed much earlier without accumulating all these debts. But Lebanon was repeatedly saved by donors and given a chance to fix its problem, which it didn't. So that's, I think, lesson number one, the moral hazard. Lesson number two is that the carrot, the incentive provided by a conditional, so I would help you if you do that, that doesn't work either. The will to reform has to come from the country itself. And if the will is there, then support can be very useful. And so the way we need to think about the said commitments, it's not about a carrot, sorry. It's more about a promise that would help Lebanon to catch up very rapidly to its potential once it fixes its own problem politically. Now, what we need to do as a community is to try to keep these plans alive, these pledges alive, this hope alive, and it takes relationship, it takes works by think tanks to keep the notion that this can happen, so that when the right moment comes, it can happen. I'll add one more element to our discussion, or rather, two elements. One is the danger of the enjoyization. It is ultimately the state need to be in a position to deliver services. Now that the capacity is not there, Haneen will talk more about it. There is a role for civil society as well to provide these services, but this ideally should be done with a view of how in the future the state and civil society can work together to deliver these services the best way. To conclude, let me just say what is our proposal in terms of the structure. We think that the best strategy, donor strategy for Lebanon, is one that walks on two legs. One leg, and this is what exists today, but it needs to be improved. The first leg, which is highly conditional, the conditional big push. Once you get your act together, we will help you catch up very quickly. We need to keep that alive. A second leg, which is to keep hope alive, society has to be not too wounded. And so support for basic services, going through the state and civil society, but in a highly controlled fashion so that it doesn't get the state off the hook and it doesn't foster clientelism. It is quite difficult to do that, but I think this is an important challenge. Yeah. Just to conclude, I would say to make that happen again, the role of civil society in monitoring, in having a coherent strategy and in monitoring what the donors do would be very crucial.
Great. I like this, ensuring that the population is not too wounded. And maybe Haneen, you could talk about what does it take actually, what's the risk of a population that gets too wounded that will not be able to bounce back in a way. And I wondered if you could maybe then talk a little bit about how this proposal on leg number 2 is designed to improve aid effectiveness and have an impact. And I also wondered if you could describe, when we talk about aid, are we talking about grants? Are we talking about loans at interest rates that are current, especially now that global interest rates are high, or at some concessionality? And are they targeted to, which populations in Lebanon specifically? So I wondered if you could address the situation on the ground and how you see it.
Thank you, Ronnie. Yeah, let me pick up on a few things that Ishat said and what you're asking. So Ishat laid out the overall framework or strategy. We call it, the two legs. And the first leg is a big one, the big push, keep on the big reforms. They have to do the macro reforms, the banking and so on. But in the meantime, we don't want the deprivation and the human capital that I discussed before to get to such a low level that the possibility of a recovery becomes almost impossible. So that's the kind of leg 2 where we really want to think through about. And I want to start actually with a quote from a recent report in September of 2023 by the IRC, International Rescue Committee. And they said, now this report was directed towards the World Bank, but it really can be generalized for other donors. Where governments can deliver, they should be supported. Where they cannot or cannot fully, donors should crowd in a wider range of partnerships with civil society to scale up capacity and enable these contexts to absorb more financing. So this IRC, well-known international NGO, they do very good work in many places. And I think this is really the concept of leg 2. So we don't want to, it's not about throwing government out. It's about knowing that in the next 5 years, the capacity of the state is going to be what it is, and hopefully it doesn't get worse. And also that if reforms start yesterday on the big reforms, institutional reforms, those will take a long time to kick in. So in that meantime, we want to preserve the place. So leg 2 comes in, which is about ensuring basic services and reaching beneficiaries directly. I mean, that's really in a nutshell. So how do we reach, in the education sector, let's take that as an example. We want to reach students directly. So you give students, poor students in particular, you give them cash transfers. If at the university level, you give them scholarships. You want to help schools because schools are really deprived of financing and they need to function and they need to, have quality programs. So you work directly to schools, you provide block grants to schools along the approach of school-based management. This has been tried in many countries and can have good successes. You want to reach teachers directly, incentivize teachers to work. So you can give teachers a top-up cash, but it should be based on some kind of productivity measure, conditional on the fact that teachers will actually come and teach and so on. So that way you have the education sector encircled, you're supporting it, it's going, the financing going directly to the beneficiaries, those who need it. And believe me, the examples that I've seen here in Lebanon that do that, they really produce wonders. With very small resources, we're talking about $10,000 a school, you can almost turn a school around, compared to the very top down approach that has been used by donors, including the World Bank, for many years, and you really have to wonder sometimes, where's all that money gone? So that's the idea. You can apply a similar thing in the health sector, where so you reach primary healthcare centers directly, hospitals directly, and so on. But all of these, and I'll come to safety net in a minute, should also have some basic conditionality within that sector. So for example, in the schools, and there has to be some third-party monitoring. There has to be some incentives, conditions on the school. There has to be maybe teacher rationalization conditions that are imposed. So there are some sector-specific basic things that need to be also insisted on by the donors. Safety net is another example, and actually that's kind of a good example in Lebanon, where the government has finally, after many, many years of efforts, now has what we call a social registry. It's basically a database of Lebanese, all the Lebanese, almost all the Lebanese that are interested in getting help, support from the government, are registered, and the whole process is digitized from registration all the way to payment. It has been able to cut out corruption and bad practices, and there's no bias in terms of who receives support. And then the support, which is in the form of cash transfer, goes directly to the households, again, through money transfer operators and the like. So this process was digitized, and that really made a big difference in terms of time and effectiveness. So these are the kind of things we foresee a leg to do. Now, of course, it is quite a big thing, because we're to embark on. It needs a real effort by the donors. Well, right now, from my view, a lot of that effort is fragmented. There are not enough coordination among the donors in terms of strategy. For example, there's more than 150 cash transfer programs in the country. Many of them are small, little decana here and there, but that's very inefficient. There are different forms of financing that come through different multi-donor trust funds. Who's looking at all of this? Of course, in a normal state, in a non-fragile conflict type of state like Lebanon, the government would be, of course, looking at all this and ensuring the coordination and the lack of fragmentation. But as we began in the beginning, we don't have that. So some structure bringing in civil society, as Ishaq mentioned, is critical to play its role of monitoring, coherence, and government, and of course, donors.
So Haneen, you described brilliantly this idea of direct support to schools, direct support to hospitals, and the role of civil society in helping do that. And then you talked about the DAM program, which is a social safety net cash transfer to the one. So the cash transfer was done through the government. How do you anticipate that the role of NGOs? I mean, in one sense, there is a great story to be told about the role of NGOs and what they've done. But if we're going to leverage and increase this amount, how do we ensure that these NGOs have the capability, the monitoring, the accounting, reporting, transparency to ensure that they are providing? Are they supplementing or supplanting the role of the state here? And just want to be sure we understand that. Or is it just a temporary until the government is in a position to do something?
No, I mean, I think there has to be very strict criteria and selection and guidelines by the donor or the financier of the NGO. It's not any NGO and every NGO. There has to be some basic and more than basic ability to deliver, transparency, capacity. So I think there needs to be kind of a filtering. And many big organizations, including some of the diaspora organizations who support Lebanon, they do that. They sort of put these NGOs into a very rigorous filter to see what is, are these really credible? And also, you have the whole issue in Lebanon, where many NGOs are essentially highly confessional, and they themselves will sort of more promote the clientelism that we're trying to reform. So there has to be an educated and more concerted look, and that's not hard. I mean, to know who's doing what and who has the capacity and who's been doing good work, and then do things through selection, through competition. And the NGO sector, civil society, of course, has to rise to the occasion as well, because they want to be a good partner and up the table. They also have a responsibility to perform better and to open their books, and to coordinate within each other. I mean, the fragmentation within the NGO sector is also large, but so that there's many important elements of accountability, mechanisms, transparency that apply to both government programs as well as the NGO players.
Yeah. I want to thank Natalie. She just posed the first question, and I want to encourage others to start asking some questions. But I wanted to just get to this question first to Isha about, we just talked about Lebanon, one of the highest indebted countries in the world. It suspended debt payments. How do you think about the role of international financial institutions like the World Bank, EBRD, EU, African Development Bank, and how, and in terms of their strategy of, where would you want to have this additional support if it is in the form of loans? And so would you use support for investment, or would you use it for, say, social protection, or how would you think about this level of support in a highly indebted country?
Right. Thank you, Ronnie. This is an important question, and I think one that is not well understood. And here we have a group dealing with finance, so I think you will get it. I mean, one would think that it's generous to lend to a bankrupt country, but the key here to understand is that World Bank or other financial institution loans are senior. And so, as long as we haven't cleaned our books, we're over indebted. Public debt is maybe 200-300% of GDP right now, depending on the exchange rate you use. At some point, as reforms get initiated, we'll have to reduce this public debt to reasonable numbers, 60-70% of GDP. So part of the debt will have to be forgiven. Now, to the extent you add senior debts on top, more of the remaining public debt will have to be forgiven. Now, a lot of this debt most of it is owned by banks. It backs deposits. And so more World Bank loan may mean at the end more haircuts on deposits, right? Unless these loans increase GDP by more than the increased debt. What matters at the end is the debt to GDP ratio. So these loans have to be productive enough to create enough wealth to actually lead to reduced haircuts at the end. And if they don't, then they actually would lead to more haircuts on deposits. We would be paying actually for these loans right now. So we have to make sure that they are productive, that they increase GDP. Now, Haneen argued very forcefully that improving social conditions also indirectly improve GDP, or don't let it deteriorate so much. But the point is, we have to check these things and put pressure on the World Bank or other institutions that lend to do so efficiently. And actually, it's not done right now. The World Bank, having worked at the World Bank for very long, is receptive to criticism, actually welcome criticism. It has an impact there. When we look at the last couple of loans, frankly, I don't think they passed the test. I mean, this loan for electricity sector, where we import electricity from Egypt through Jordan with a pipeline through Syria, is just crazy. And of course, it will not happen. We just lost time. A recent loan to agriculture goes to big farms and not small farms, with procurement through CDR, which we know is corrupt and used for clientelistic purposes by some politicians. no civil society group wrote a review of this project. Should have.
Yeah. I want to start bringing in some questions and linking it to the question. There is, Haneen, there's two questions I wanted to ask you. One was from Natalie, talks about support for the health system and reaching the nursing workforce directly. Big shortage of nursing, and is there effort to address this of qualified nurses? And I think it's linked to a bigger question on the role of civil society that Sasha's also asking. What's experience in other countries do we have in terms of, the role of civil society in delivering these basic services, and maybe the role of the diaspora, and maybe even of life? Can you maybe talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, on the nursing workforce, yeah, I agree. I mean, I can't answer what programs there are ongoing. I don't think the World Bank has, but potentially UNICEF or WHO. I actually don't know. But I agree that efforts to try to keep this qualified workforce, whether it be nurses or teachers or what have you, needs to be. Now, this does require, I mean, the long-term, the medium-term approach is, of course, a wide civil service or public service reform, which really goes through what are the needs, the demand, qualifications, and then appropriate wage structure and other benefits and so on. But that is, of course, one of these big conditional reforms or big macro reforms, which are not going to happen overnight. In the meantime, as was happening in the education sector last year, and it's happening again, teachers were given top-ups to their basic salary, a cash top-up, but it was based on a condition that they had to show up for work and teach. And then there was a monitoring system that was put in place to monitor that and to verify that they actually came in. So these kind of things, you can call it a productivity incentive. These kind of things, if done well, can work. And they were already starting, supported by UNICEF and World Bank. And this year, I understand the ministry itself is doing this. But one can also wonder, if they're doing it themselves, who's going to be monitoring? This is where we mentioned the role of third-party monitors, which is a role for civil society to play, becomes very important. And on Sasha's question, yeah, there's many countries where civil society plays a big role. Indonesia is one of the first countries that I worked on, where NGO/civil society was very active in implementing community-based programs, and until now it's still a flagship around the world. And so in a way, you can look at civil society having several roles. One is more on not the implementation, but on the like a watchdog function. And the second would be implementation, and these probably should be separate. And one NGO should not be doing the same thing. And I think definitely diaspora can play a role. As I mentioned before, diaspora groups who are really keen to support Lebanon need to know who's a credible local player to finance. And so homework has to be done in terms of figuring out who are the credible groups to work with. And that has been done and is being done by organizations, including LIFE, of course. And SEAL and others have a good kind of I would say almost like an accreditation system.
There's a question by Rima about the role of digitization on civil society and donor level when it comes to cash transfers. What about data protection? And she says GDPR. I don't know what GDPR means. And I guess the bigger question is this issue of does the promise of e-government, the promise of digital government, digital services, can it help us leapfrog in terms of service delivery and really help kind of improve the coordination and perhaps the quality of services being delivered by the state through a whole range of people?
I mean, I'm a big believer in digitization and the role that it can play in more effective aid, more effective implementation, effective programs. And we have seen it. As I mentioned, in 2019, prior to the crisis, the way the cash transfers in the government program were implemented were on an Excel sheet. I mean, almost. People went into local centers and they signed, they filled in and by hand their form, their request to be eligible, and then data got entered into Excel sheets, and that's how things happened. So when we came into help Lebanon with its after post-crisis with a new and modern social safety net cash transfer program, we insisted on this and this be totally digitized from beginning to end. And after a lot of pain, but it happened. And currently, as I mentioned, half of the Lebanese population exists in a database. And it has all these data protection things that Rima has mentioned, and GDPR, which is EU standards for data protection and the like. And the partnership was with a private company. So we insisted that the government, they're not going to have to do this themselves. So they partnered with a company, a local company in Lebanon who designed this and who helped basically get all this off the ground. So it can be done. And once this is done, it really is very, very powerful. And now the next step, honestly, would be for these different NGOs who have their databases of poor and vulnerable families to link in with this government database. Now, this would be really a big improvement in terms of reducing duplication, because what you have is there are some people who are getting assistance in Lebanon, others who are not, who may be equally poor, but it's because maybe you fell under a certain particular area and that area was supported by a particular NGO and the like, but there may be others, if you didn't belong, who are left out. So linking these databases, and this is actually my dream to do, is to bring some of the big NGOs that have big databases of poor and vulnerable families, link that up with the government. Doesn't mean give your data in, but link it up with all the good standards of GDPR with the government database, and then you have something really powerful within which you can base not just cash transfers on, but education programs, health, and so on.
So GDPR, thank you, Samia, is the global data protection regulations that enforced by the EU. So, so this is partly a single a way to identify all the particular recipients of aid. I wanted to ask you, there's a question by Omar, but I also wanted to bring it into a larger question. He asks, is there a way to increase the trust of the Lebanese diaspora and have them invest in Lebanon? And I know there's a number of initiatives where some diaspora might be willing to either contribute cash and or an investment to particular parts, villages or towns that they're from, and the role of the diaspora beyond just say depositing money in a bank account to help leverage these remittances and to contribute to more productive sectors. And how do you see it fit into the bigger mix of investment?
Yeah, thank you. An important question. There are some NGOs that are more reputable than others that are channeling money to particular schools, clinics. I think what we need is to go beyond that and involve the diaspora in going beyond that. And because this is a marathon, it's a long. The challenge is for several years. We need to think about the next at least 5 years in terms of preserving these services, and so we need to think more about sector programs and strategies and collective action. And I think this is really where work is needed. Now, with Haneen and a few others, we're involved in bringing together about 10 think tanks to act as a little bit the brain of civil society in terms of directing efforts, strategies, with the Secretariat to review programs and monitor and put pressure on various actors to do the right things. Now, besides that, it would be very useful to put more effort in various sector associations, health, education, maybe safety net. I mean, education is probably the most ready to come together because there have been many efforts by many NGOs and they meet together And so there is already a sense of a national strategy that could really, be consolidated. Uh, and this kind of avoids duplication, avoids having holes. And what they're trying to do is, I think, two things. A, top up salaries for teachers. Hanin could talk more about that. But also direct support directly to schools if schools obey some conditions, are transparent, provide good education, maybe non-sectarian and the like. And so a mechanism like that could help people, organization in diaspora, channel funds directly to schools, but within a plan that covers the whole territory in a balanced way. I think we need to get organized. Basically, in many countries have this kind of organization. Civil society is organized, federated, has a brain, secretariats. We don't have that yet, although the potential is there. To what extent can the diaspora, I mean, this is a powerful group, help in making such organization, happen?
So, what is the name of this effort that you're talking about in terms of all these think tanks trying to create a common framework to try to help direct civil society organizations and others? What is it called? Or is there what is this effort called? Or
Hanin, you know more.
So right now, we're calling it Lebanon Aid Monitoring and Assessment Platform, the platform, until we have more clarity on who's going to be in it. But as this said, the idea is to bring civil society, think tanks, experts around the table to foresee whether there's agreement on this leg one, leg two approach, and collectively put together a plan for how we would it's not just monitoring, it's really about helping and trying to get the best out of the aid. Don't forget that, as Hap mentioned in the beginning, Lebanon is getting almost $2 billion in grants a year. All of Syria, with its huge size and even bigger catastrophes and war, gets $2 billion a year. So it's not a bad sum, $2 billion. But this, one has to ask the question, is this being used the best way? And if we don't ask that question, we're never going to know the answer. So part of what this group would be doing is to ask that tough question and think about it and challenge government, challenge donors, challenge also civil society who's been active in this.
Yeah.
Let me add quickly maybe something. There is an interesting tool out there where we haven't put enough effort, it seems to be. It's a fund that was created by the EU, World Bank, and others. Has a funny name, the 3RF. It means something, but nobody knows what. And it's a special fund in the sense that it's supposed to receive humanitarian funding from various organizations and to rechannel it to sectors according to, as we're talking here, around an organized strategy. And what's interesting about it is that it involves both government and civil society very centrally in its governance, in the delivery, in the monitoring and evaluation. Now, this fund hasn't functioned very well, frankly, and there's a lot of criticism against it. The government has tried to monopolize kind of influence there. But it's an opportunity, to actually lobby to make it function better, as opposed to forget about it and go to something else. It's the right legal construct. It's a great instrument to try to shape to our needs.
Yeah. I mean, so drilling down a little bit more. I mean, Fahad asks this really interesting question, building on what you were talking about, Hanin. How might alternative financing mechanisms disrupt the current power dynamics? Because ultimately, I think that we're all kind of saying the same thing. You're ultimately trying to alter the current, political system at the moment. Are there traditional approaches beyond avenues like taxation, government allocations, individual contributions, which can help, which have been deployed in the region to mobilize necessary budgets for reform? So I guess this question is about, ultimately the reforms are trying to alter domestic political dynamics, and what are we looking towards creating, and what might be mechanisms to help improve that?
I mean, I like incentives a lot. And when you give a school, for example, money directly based on particular criteria and outcomes that they define, and then hold them accountable in the end for what they define, you will get good results. Similarly, when you give households some cash, and in fact, you make it conditional, let's say, on certain behaviors like send your kid to school, make sure you get vaccinated, your children, so on, you incentivize behavior change. And I think so it's less about the source of money that Fahad's asking about, but about how do you use it that can really make a difference, change the incentives in the system, introduce accountability, and you can have better outcomes.
Yes, Ishaq.
Ola has a very good suggestion that I really support. I mean, following the port explosion, there was some support through some funds, I think through the 3RF actually, to support SMEs, small and medium enterprises. And this was highly successful. And, when we think of basic services, we need to think also productive. I mean, lots of small enterprises don't have access to funds right now with the banking sector collapsed, and the MFI, the microfinance institutions in Lebanon are very well developed, but they are in very bad shape. But they have very large capacity. They can serve hundreds of thousands of small businesses that can generate income and business and keep people away from safety nets. Reviving the MFI system in Lebanon would be a tremendous, I think, goal that is highly achievable. This is something we need to focus on much more.
No, absolutely. I just wanted to add to that, and this was, a very vibrant sector before 2019. Now, of course, financially, it got impacted with the whole financial situation, but this is where I think B5 and more can be done. Yes, 3RF indeed is not a fund. We're aware of that. It is the groupings of the EU, UN, and World Bank, and civil society and government to come around initially after the Port of Beirut explosion to do reform, reconstruction, and recovery. And this financing facility, the Lebanon financing facility, which the World Bank manages, but and that unfortunately has attracted very minimal amount. Last time I heard it was only $100 million compared to the $2 billion that's going out there. While you have another UN managed fund, Emergency Recovery Fund, which dates from 2006, I think. And then, of course, but most funds are essentially going directly from bilateral donors to UN, to NGOs, and that. I mean, that is what needs to be coordinated, and maybe one big multi-donor trust fund to play. That's how you'll bring coherence. Bring money through one channel. You bring coherence and coordination on the strategy, which I really believe we don't have in Lebanon. For such a small country, should not be hard to do. Done in much larger, complex countries easily.
I think Gilbert captures a sentiment of many Lebanese. When you mentioned the public sector, the government, people have zero trust. But I wondered whether you can help us nuance it a little bit. Or every agency, every institution, every ministry as enactor, are there any institutions that have proven to be a bit more effective than others and that we can work with? Because obviously, even in the best efforts of bringing in a multi-donor trust fund and coordinating through think tanks, there has to be some effort at least to try to work with some level of government, as you said, to coordinate at least and merge the recipients if we're going to do individual cash transfers, say, or so how do we think about government beyond just a blanket statement, and are there any institutions that are being more effective than others?
Let me have a stab at that.
Yes.
Yes, there are some institutions, and we don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. And we worked with one to establish the registry, the social registry for cash transfers, and this is the Central Inspection Office. has a very good leader, and you need that. You need leadership. You need any organization, public or private, needs leadership at the top, who's visionary, who believes in contracting out, working with private sector. And so we support them. We found that there is that place, and we supported it. There are other places, you know, the well-known Basir Flihan Institute of Finance within the Ministry of Finance, and other pockets in the government, which do need to be supported, yes, until the rest of government can come around. But and donors are doing that, and I know at least for World Bank, this is a priority. EU and others, it is important to do that. We got to do more of it. We got to push more, because these little pockets of excellence within the public administration are also being embattled by the corrupt deep state. So donors, civil society, we need to protect them. We need to advocate for them. We need to keep pushing, for more of them to happen. So I think that that's important, absolutely, to do. So Waleed is asking this question about policy
Yes.
dialogue platform. So there are two different things here. The 3RF is this policy dialogue platform. We're supposed to bring donors and government, civil society around the table to coordinate funding. And then related to it, but not part of it, is an actual financing mechanism called the LFF, where the money goes through, and that has about $100 million only. They are separate, indeed. Now, we're talking about a different platform for civil society that Ishaq mentioned, that we hope we'll be able to launch within the next few weeks, which is purely, as we said, civil society to act like a watchdog on aid assistance in Lebanon.
Well, we're looking forward to the establishment of this platform and see how it kind of evolves and how we could support it. I know we reached the end of the hour. I just wanted to see whether Ishaq and Haneen, you have any final reflections you want to share with the audience before we close. And I'll just make a final statement. That's it. Ishaq?
Well, just thank you for the opportunity. It was great speaking to such a great group, large number of people on such an important issues, and I hope we can follow up over time.
Great. Haneen, any final reflections?
Just to say that there's a lot of work to be done. Lebanon is in a very critical stage. I think while money is an issue and it does need more money, it's about how we do things and how we get it to people. A people first strategy basically is what we're calling for in this period going forward to save the country.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I couldn't think of two more qualified people to talk about this issue from a kind of global, policy perspective, as well as somebody with deep and effective experience on the ground, having done this work. I want to thank you again for taking the time to do this and share your insights with the Life membership and others. And we look forward to having you on future programs and learning more about the platform and how it becomes successful. Have a great day, and thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you.